Welcome, Daron Acemoglu and Interintellect. What a beautiful pleasure to have you here. Your new book, What Happened to Liberal Democracy, is all about community and deliberation and kind of going back to the ancient art of, contrasting views and experimenting and failing and learning from each other. I feel like this is what we have been doing for 7 years now on Interintellect. And most people on Interintellect will know you through sorry, Why Nations Fail. I think that was the first book of yours that we discussed in depth. But there have
Oh,
been
I'm
several.
delighted to hear that. Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah,
Anna.
yeah, yeah. You have a lot of fans here. But we've also been on this kind of trip for the past year, and we've hosted several of our favorite thinkers from like Peter Turchin and Applebaum, Frank Fukuyama, Kaushik Basu, Kyla Scanlon, Leah Ipi is coming up. So we have been in a kind of deep dive into what happened with liberal democracy and what happens when we have an institutional crisis coinciding with labor transformation and where people have to rethink what knowledge, success, money, living somewhere even means. And to my great delight, your new book, which I just finished, is basically all about this. So this is such a beautiful timing, and thank you. I know you're super busy and you're in the middle of some kind of a Twitter feud like Katy Perry right now. So, it's an extra valuable thing that you're here. How are you, and what do you make of this great kind of outcry over your actually very brief treatment of artificial intelligence in this new book? Why do you think it triggered people so much?
I don't know. People can draw their own inference.
So you've said what you've said, and the people will have to read the book
Yes.
before creating
Yeah, I've long wanted to write a book on AI. It's so fast changing that I didn't think I could keep up with the cycle of improvements in the models and the issues. But this book has half a chapter out of 10 on AI, so it's not really a book on AI, despite what The Economist thinks.
yeah, but the people picked up on it. I think this is a very hot button topic right now. The first thing that caught my attention with the book is how it starts. You start with the Scorpions song, so now it in my head for a month. The Wind of Change, which was the
Yes,
anthem of my childhood. I'm a child of the, fall of the Berlin Wall. And actually, my first question, and we will have a little bit of a chat, and then we will open to the audience. It's
excellent.
really around, like I always feel in America that if you've seen the kind of bad alternative personally, if you know what comes after freedom or instead of it, you never really sit down and think, oh, well, what if we went back? Oh, what if we created a liberal system? Oh, well, blah, blah, blah. But it's not very intuitive to people who've never seen what happens when these fundamental freedoms are taken away openly or in an implicit way. Would you agree with that? And do you think that you have an extra, kind of ammunition and a unique point of view just because, you have seen other alternatives?
Well, I mean, I think there is an element of that. I actually have some research that suggests sometimes people's willingness to support alternatives to democratic government institutions is related to the fact that they haven't experienced the alternative. But we also have support for authoritarianism in East Germany, in Hungary, among people who lived under the Soviet or communist rule. So it's not that simple. I think it's really an anti-establishment feeling that because liberal democracy hasn't delivered what it promised, what it's capable of promising, people are reacting to it, and it's an understandable grievance, but it's not a productive one because none of the alternatives to liberal democracy, from Trump to Reform Party in the UK to Orban, really have uh, policies or ideas that can really grapple with these fundamental challenges. And moreover, they all, for by design or as a byproduct, weaken institutions and trust in institutions, therefore further reducing our capability to deal with challenging issues.
So there's an element of nostalgia, if I understand your model correctly, where, I mean, I do know
I
some.
wouldn't even call it nostalgia because it's not like they want to go back to something that they knew that's been lost but was good. Like Nigel Farage doesn't offer anything that's feasibly good for the economic conditions of the British people, but it's just anti-establishment. It's like a kick in the gut of the establishment people and establishment parties, and sometimes anger and grievance demands that.
In narrative, there is nostalgia, right? Like Farage was take
Yes,
back control, make America great again. So you do have the kind of
yes,
deceptive
yes.
repetitiveness. But there is some backward looking in your book as well, right? I mean, you do. I mean, as I felt reading it, there is an assumption that there were moments in history when
Absolutely,
democracy
absolutely.
worked well, but instead of going kind of counter-revolutionary and saying, okay, we tried this, this doesn't work, it's not 100%, let's go to the exact opposite. What you're trying to do is kind of to go back to the root of what made it work. Do I understand this correctly?
100%. I think it's very important that we go back in history and trace things that worked. Because otherwise, it's like saying, I have a plan, I know it will work, but there's no evidence that it will work. And most such plans, whether they are from the left or the right, actually don't work. When they've been tried, they have failed, or when their cousins have been tried, they have failed badly. Whereas what I want to say is that there was a social compact that really delivered on liberal democracy's promises. It was supported by a broad liberal democratic coalition. It was inspired by liberal ideas, but it was of its time, it was something that would have worked, that could have worked, and that did work in the industrial era when economic relations and local governance and coalitions were of one particular sort that the post-industrial economy doesn't support. So the question then is, can we learn from that and have what I call a governing philosophy, which is sort of a set of aspirations with practical steps that will support the recreation of the good parts in a very different environment that has much greater polarization, social media, AI, much bigger segment of the economy that's managerial, that's college educated, a bigger divide between the college educated and non-college educated, more cultural conflicts than there were perhaps in 80, 90 years ago. So that's why what I'm offering isn't the same as social democracy, but it is related to social democracy. Because social democracy, in some sense, was a way of realizing liberal ideals in an industrial economy with a strong unionized working class, which could be the basis of the organization of certain segments of society. That's no longer feasible. The blue collar workers are very different, so labor organizations will have to be look different. Working classes character is very different, and the cultural and economic grievances are very different.
Thank you so much. And before we, open soon the floor for the questions of our attendees as well, would you just like guide us through how you model this shift from industrial to post-industrial society and how you see some of the mechanisms that sometimes kind of as a byproduct produce the kind of the Habermasian deliberation where people feel included in how things are going. They feel like they have a voice or that they can appoint somebody who does have a voice, as opposed to kind of like facing the faceless monster that the left today will claim to be feeling. So just to kind of like maybe for those who did not read the book yet, what
Thank you,
struck
Anna.
you?
That's I would love to do that because that's the heart of the book in some sense. Uh, so and the arc of the argument of the book is that liberal ideas are critical for human flourishing because they provide both the means for people to realize their potentials, dreams, and contribute to both material and social collective knowledge. And it also provides tools and an environment for that knowledge to be uh, to to spread in society and then to turn into actions, policies, institutions, technologies, norms that could serve the betterment of our condition. And that betterment is rooted in voice and self-government, shared prosperity, meaning economic growth from which nobody is left behind, and public services that are important for people to be able to participate in the economy and realize their potential. All of these promises were realized for a pretty long time in 20th century, but that was based on a particular set of coalitions and a particular set of economic relations. In particular, in the industrial age, companies, when they wanted to invest, innovate, and expand, they needed workers. And in the framework created by democratic governments and labor organizations, that meant that they couldn't cheat or shortchange workers, so they have to pay them higher wages, and they would create jobs, and that would create the most powerful pathway to shared prosperity, higher wages, and employment growth. Governments were supportive in terms of creating that framework and providing public services. And there was a broad coalition that enabled that to remain in place and also provide voice participation to people, starting from local communities or associations, including labor organizations and other associations that were quite active both in Europe and in the United States. And the sort of compromise that was between different segments in society. That's very well captured, for example, in Scandinavian social democracy, which involved the big coalition, workers, the middle classes, then the agrarian workers, the agrarian party, then the business interests under a corporatist model. Same thing in the United States with the New Deal coalition, and so on. All of that came to an end in two ways in the post-industrial age, especially with digital technologies, but also with globalization. One is that digital technologies started creating much greater levels of inequality, favoring the more educated segments, but especially once they became a platform for automation, numerically controlled machinery, robots, software systems started severing the link between business expansion and shared prosperity because now you could lay off workers and still produce more next thanks to automation technologies. Hence, not easy, especially for workers who could be replaced by machines or algorithms to share that prosperity. And we see that exact pattern in the United States and parts of Europe. But also, they changed that coalition's nature. The college-educated groups both became richer, socially more influential because they filled all the administrative, managerial, technical positions. But they also started diverging in terms of their values. First, because they became more numerous, interacting with each other. They became more segregated, living in their own neighborhoods, working in their own firms. The industrial firm of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s was a melting pot. Today's firms are much more segregated by education. Think of Google versus McDonald's. And they started marrying each other, befriending each other, and having very different social values. And that really deepened both the cultural conflicts within society, but also made them much less in touch with the grievances of the less well-educated segments of society. And that really mattered because during this process, the college educated people like us, especially those who live in urban areas, uh, and our votes really count in that, took over the center left. The center left, which was the sort of the became the establishment, but as it was becoming the establishment, it also ceased to become the party of the working classes. In fact, today, less educated segments of society in the UK, in Germany, in France, in the US, in Spain, in Italy, is much more likely to vote for the center right or the hard right whereas they used to vote overwhelmingly for the Labour Party, for Social Democrats, for the Democratic Party. And the college educated, which typically supported the center right before, is now firmly behind the center left. But that college educated segment did not take any active actions to stem the inequality, to deal with technology and globalization in a different way. That's what I call the sins of omission. But it also then tried to impose its values on diverse communities, which I think goes against the principles of self-government and freedom of speech that liberalism in its heyday was, never fully, but in a at least in a philosophical way, committed to. So it really created this confusion for liberalism, which we need to move beyond with the what I'm calling for a new governing philosophy.
I mean, the Trump vote to the loss of the working class, I think, was the greatest kind of shock, positively if you are on the right, and very negatively if you are on the left. And you see this, I mean, I'm Eastern European, so for us, liberal is a little bit more on the right, as you sometimes pointed out. It means like you're like pro-business and you're kind of a cosmopolitan and you want your kids to go to university abroad and you want to catch up. That's kind of the Eastern European way of being a liberal. But here it's very, very, very different. But you also have left-wing movements on the right in America that come with a lot of, I mean, the whole MAGA movement in some sense is, modeling on the grassroots movements of like Upton Sinclair's era. And this whole kind of chaos is relatively new, and it comes from probably why you spend quite a bit of time in the book trying to even explain what liberalism is, because it has become this Rorschach test politically. That it's so,
100%.
and it's easy to be
100%.
disappointed by something that you didn't never really outline what it should be delivering.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And but it's very important in my mind, and that also explains why I don't devote any time to the alternatives to liberalism in this book. I don't talk about Trump. I don't talk about Farage. I don't talk about the alt-right. I don't talk about fascism because I don't think that liberalism's enemies today are any more formidable than they were in the 1920s or 1930s. So it's just like the Roman Empire. It's being brought down by the barbarians, but not because the barbarians are particularly strong, it's because it has itself its internal problems it hasn't resolved. So I think the way forward isn't to defeat Trump. It's not good. I mean, it's of course better than the alternative, but it's no good to win the next election, but still fail to deliver on liberalism promises because then there will be another Trump. And that's exactly what we experienced in 2020, between 2020 and 2024.
Are you generally pro the abundance movement? Because this is something that they talk about. Like, what do you do with a world where the red city is built more? No?
I mean,
Did I
of
did I
course,
say the A word?
I
Sorry.
don't, I mean, it's just like it is a little indicative of just like we're not generating deep enough ideas. Of course, the regulatory impasse that has been created over many years is very costly, and it's partly, not only partly, responsible for the low quality of public services. But if you don't have a deep diagnosis of a problem, you cannot have the you cannot articulate durable solutions. I don't understand what is the diagnosis of the abundance movement. Is it that the left is stupid, that they've just don't understand, or is there something else? And then the other aspect of the abundance debate is it conflates two things that are, I think, very distinct. One is, excessive regulations can be stifling, that's for sure. But then linking that to AI and somehow inferring from there that we should not regulate AI is just a category error. AI is so different than building bridges and uh, and doing environmental tests, etc. AI is going to be such an transformative technology, and its current direction, I think, is a real threat to the shared prosperity model, or a deepening of that threat that has already taken place with previous digital technologies. That just letting AI go in whatever direction it's going to do, and then sort of somehow think that we can build a better society around it, I think is just too cavalier an attitude.
You talk a lot about the working class liberalism and its or that idea and its definition. And every time you bring up the working class, and I think everybody reading this book in 2026 will think, what is the working class? Is the working class somebody who still works in a factory on American soil, which obviously is going to be less and less. I mean, that's at least my idea that I think is going to be kind of irreversibly less prominent in the future. Is this the Uber driver that I just wrote here with, who has I don't know, PhD in psychology and is still like completing his studies, who is the working class? And, I feel like whenever you bring up AI, and this is the second half of my question, there's a positive angle on AI in the book, which is that, why not help nurses retrain with AI? And why not help, the Uber driver retrain with better car software? So there, I see that your redefinition with liberalism is working class liberalism that requires a redefinition of what the working class is. And then AI is not that far away from it.
That's right. 100%. AI is really central for that reason. By working class, I mean everybody who earns their living mostly by receiving wages. And that's links to my earlier emphasis that the path to shared prosperity that we have tried and succeeded in, and that's the only one that I think is sustainable, is to create jobs and high wages. That would lift us all. You and I are white collar. We don't compete with painters and welders, but painters and welders compete with custodial workers and technicians compete with accountants. So we're all part of a big labor market with different levels of substitution. So buoyant labor demand that is across the board would lift wages and salaries for all of us. That's the dream of shared prosperity. Now, we know, and that's a lot of my research is about that, when you had disruptive automation technologies, that severing of that link that I described happened. It did not happen uniformly. It didn't affect us, you and me and Anna, but it did really affect the painters and welders and operators on factory floors because they then went and competed against construction workers. It affected the construction workers. And it also affected a lot of office workers, clerical workers that had software-based automation. Now with AI, the danger is that we're going to have something much larger because AI's ambition, and it's not a done deal, but it's a realistic ambition, is to impact many, 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 many sectors at the same time. So that's why there is something that unites us even more than at the time of robots and other automated machinery in the factory on the factory floor. But critically, my take on AI isn't pie in the sky. It's not like, oh, you should stop AI, or wouldn't it be nicer if we didn't have AI? The genie is out of the bottle. But I argue that there is nothing, absolutely nothing in the nature of AI that should be anti-worker. And it would be both feasible and socially more beneficial and also much more consistent with liberal democracy to steer AI in a pro-worker direction. And then I try to explain what that pro-worker direction is, give examples, and then explain how that can be done.
And then there's this interesting contradiction there as well, which is that, many people think that it's actually the white collar people who will be automated. It's the economists who will be, less, maybe that will be a less lucrative job when, some pro AI can just write papers and it's the email job that will be automated, whereas the nurse, the construction worker who works with the atoms and the touch and the human presence might be the last to be replaced. And so I think the fear kind of runs rampant at every strata of society today. Nobody knows.
100%. 100%. My guess is that you'll still have your job, Anna, in 10 years' time.
Hopefully for
You're
it.
doing well. Uh, but the ambition here is that ultimately AI is going to merge with robotics. So it's going to start influencing occupations that involve significant interaction with the real world as well. And then also it really depends on what skills are commodified and what skills aren't. If it's really very commodified skills that involve some carrying, etc., people are not going to have huge expertise or they're not going to receive huge salaries for that. So that also does not support a path to shared prosperity. But there is a lot of uncertainty. I think AI models they have amazing capabilities, but they don't have judgment yet. So I wouldn't be comfortable, you know, AI taking over, air traffic control at the moment, or starting running ammunition companies, or becoming CEOs. So that there is a lot of uncertainty about the speed and the exact sequence with which AI could affect different industries. But the bigger uncertainty, I would say, is that forecasting AI is not like weather forecasts. We control AI.
Hmm.
That by that, what I mean is
Some degree, yeah.
some humans control AI. And actually, in a democratic society, we as citizens have a say. The fact that we have not used that say is a choice. Is a choice we made. That's our failure. Is a choice that was imposed on us by politicians. It's their failure. And it's a choice that was encouraged by the media. It is their failure. But we don't need to keep on failing.
And politically as well, you have once again these paradoxical situations. On the one hand, you have, a political future ahead with AI perfected personalized ads, fake news, fake ads politically to like maybe prey on your vulnerabilities and your prejudices. On the other hand, we have LLMs, which are politically extremely normie, and they are the last centrists left in American life. It's very unlikely that Claude Fable would steer somebody really towards radicalization the same way as a badly chosen Reddit page would. So again, you have this seesaw, and which side will be heavier.
That's always been a debate, both in social media and now in the context of AI, whether you want large companies that centralize information but have some degree of accountability versus open source models, smaller companies that may be harder to control. I'm actually very troubled by centralization. Whenever we have centralized things in history, it hasn't ended up that well. And the extent of centralization of information in a few models is really unparalleled. The fact that there is some competition, well, a lot of competition between OpenAI and Anthropic and Google doesn't really redress the problem that they're all centralizers.
It's central planning, to better or worse. And you know why Peter Thiel called AI communist, and everybody thought it was a joke at the time, and he kind of just once again saw the future. My last question before the audience is very welcome to raise their hands or ask something in Zoom, and I will read it up. One of my favorite things to think about is how all great revolutions always break out at university campuses from, I think, basically the French Revolution, right? Like Robespierre and all these guys were high school, middle school, schoolmates.
High
So we
school,
have
high
a bunch
school.
of young guys, a lot of time, a lot of reading, and they want new stuff. And they don't yet have to worry about their property and their spouses and children, right? It's perfect. It's like Neil Ferguson would say it's the perfect kind of algorithm for a revolution. But even if you look at less extreme ways of how groups make decisions and want a different future, you have to be physically present. And a lot of the examples that you bring up around shared deliberation required the workers basically to be in the same place. I mean, all these strikes, 1800s, 1900s, I mean, they were physically together all day and had time to, I don't know, in smoke breaks or whilst doing whatever they were doing, to share their views and realize that, it kind of sucks for all of us. We might as well do something about it. But what happens with the working class that is completely discrete and decentralized? When people are working from home, when people don't even go out necessarily in the evening because they just watch Netflix, when a gig worker gets a TaskRabbit or Uber Eats request on his or her phone and just completes the task, and it's almost gamified like a Pikachu collection, Pokemon game. How does and maybe Noah Smith will correct me on this because we have our own debate about social media, but where else can these people align their views and create the kind of shared deliberation and social learning that to you, Daron, is so integral in this book and how you think about shared learning if we are not together physically? And I do think that we will not be together physically. So I'm trying to find what the alternatives would be, what would be a new institutions of deliberation where people are not working in the same office building or factory or school all day together.
Well, that's an excellent question, Anna. But I think there are three separate issues. It is indeed true that, in the words of a radical of the 18th century, factories were Socratic clubs of revolution. But that's because they played three roles at the same time that are in principle distinct. They created solidarity. That's the most important. They created exchange of information. That's very, very important. But also crucially, they made labor critical for production because you could only produce in the factory. So today, we have a solidarity crisis. That's why a significant portion of the book is devoted to community. Liberals of the last half century made a both strategic and philosophical mistake in rejecting community. Community is essential. It's a double-edged sword, as I try to explain in the book. It sometimes is a threat to freedoms, but it is essential for the flourishing of liberalism. So if we can rebuild community, I think we have pathways to build solidarity. Digital technologies, the internet, and all sorts of other things also give us other means to exchange information. We can turn AI to our advantage. We can turn, many people, many smart people in the late 1990s and early 2000s thought that the internet and social media would be democratizing. They weren't foolish. Their hopes were dashed, but that was a possibility. We just chose not to do that. Thanks, Facebook. And then third, and that's the critical one, you need that the workers have power. That is the big problem, Anna. If AI continues to go in an automation direction, at some point workers become dispensable. Once they become dispensable, even if you're organized, even if you're in the same workplace, who cares? You don't have any power because you say, I will withdraw my labor, and the company will say, fine, we don't need you anyway. That's good. I was trying to get rid of you. Now you just got rid of yourself. So that's why we have a window of opportunity for organizing society before that AGI type dystopia happens.
Maybe some of the woke movements were a moment of solidarity. I mean, Me Too and other relatively successful, but they also happened on
No,
campus.
because they divided often.
Mm,
I think,
the backlash.
yeah, the backlash, but also if you divide even the working class into oppressors and oppressed, that's not a great formula for building a broad coalition.
Mhm.
Yeah, I see the need for enemies. Sometimes that solidifies your coalition. But if you overdo it, both it becomes constricting, but also it makes backlash much more likely and your coalition much weaker.
I mean, for unionized working class, though, there is an enemy, right? I mean, in the Marxist sense, like they organize against, I mean, even if broadly they are on board with the mission of whatever they are creating, the union is to create a force field, right,
Yes.
against a very powerful opponent.
Yeah. But what I would say is that the most successful labor organization drives, though they start from recognizing that there is an opponent, ultimately make deals with that opponent. And the success of Nordic social democracy is unimaginable without the corporatist model. And you might have other objections to the corporatist model, but the corporatist model is all about a bargain between capital and labor, between big business and trade unions. Business unionism in the United States tried to achieve that, except that it was undercut in many places. And the experience for, we don't have like very, very precise evidence on this, but there's a lot of anecdotal and circumstantial evidence that communist and Marxist unions have not been very successful in delivering anything in terms of wage growth or employment growth to the workers because they created a much more conflictual environment with business. And if business thinks, not incorrectly, that unions are not just trying to get a better deal, but they're trying to take over the means of production or engineer a revolution and conditions for a revolution, that's going to make a good deal for the workers much harder.
And this is where your distinction between the social contract and the compact comes into play, right? Your method is much more dialectical. Like let's have constant kind of ambient conflict and always update because it's
100%.
much more of a flexible system
100%.
than
And then
something
the
like
main reason for that is because I don't think liberalism or any other philosophy worth its salt for that matter can give us a recipe for how we should behave in the modern world. It provides a framework, and we have to form our own compromises in those gray areas. That is key.
I'm going to stop asking my own questions at this point and just open the floor. I know that Daniela and DJ, you had your hand up earlier. Was it because you lowered it because I answered your question or Darren answered your question, or
Oh
just
no, I
you
just
were
realized that
being too polite?
you were
John, is
so
it okay
on.
if I go to Daniela and DJ first, just to like be extremely fair here? We can't really have a discussion about fairness without treating the audience with utmost fairness. So, Daniela and DJ, the floor is yours first.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I could just really push on the point about regulation versus deregulation. Um, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that the dominant companies of the last 40 years are among the least regulated and and can, and to the degree they are regulated, the leverage point of that until recently, the leverage point of a new employee, right? The effect on marginal profitability was so enormous that you could spend a little bit more. If you're Apple and you literally run the most profitable retail establishments in history, um, you're willing to pay whatever the compliance costs are around employment versus someone who runs a local services firm that hauls trash. And and then just more broadly, housing in particular. I mean, people talk about the housing theory of everything in terms of cost drivers. And it's just, and the left loves to point to FDR. We need a new FDR. Well, the great thing about FDR is he had an overwhelmingly huge coalition, a crisis, and no regulations, right? He could just make it up and just go build a dam in a couple of years if he wanted to. And high-speed rail is the in California still can't be built. So I just wonder if that's being underweighted as a way to just relieve some of the pressure that kind of creates so much frustration.
Thank you for your question, and sorry that I did not give a complete uh, representation of my arguments in the book on the regulation issue. Uh, I think that the way that I put it in the book is that we have so many ineffective and inefficient regulations that make it harder for liberal democracy to reach some of its main aims, which includes providing better quality public services, better schools, uh, and also sort of encourage job creation. On the other hand, in social media and in tech, we are dealing with new transformative technologies and some of the largest corporations humanity has ever seen. And they have gotten to this point of size partly because of lack of regulation and lack of antitrust enforcement. And I believe we really need to create a new framework for regulation. It's not the same old framework. In fact, I complain about the fact that we have a very reactive regulatory framework. You let AI companies or tech companies do whatever they want, and then at some point it bothers somebody, and then you start putting regulatory barriers. That's very inefficient and ineffective. So we need proactive regulation that's based on where we want AI to go and how we want social media to be part of the ecosystem consistent with individual freedom of speech. And we need to find the right policies and institutions for them. So if I were to simplify, and this is a massive simplification, what I'm saying is we need much less regulation of road building, construction, uh, uh, several overlapping environmental regulatory things. By the way, that's partly because we don't have a carbon tax. So if we had a carbon tax, we wouldn't need so many regulations. And instead, we need a much better framework for regulating social media and a new way of thinking of how to steer AI in a more beneficial direction.
I think you should have a conversation with the abundance people. Just I feel like maybe there is, you know, after a couple of drinks, maybe there was something interesting would come out of not totalizing the regulatory framework as the biggest evil, but that there is definitely something there. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I haven't read the book, and I'm not an academic. I don't study the research on any of these things, so all I can give is my kind of anecdotal experience. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. So I started fiddling around with computers when I was 13 years old, and now I'm 50. So in that space of time, I've seen quite some changes. And now I am in a massive company building software that uses LLMs extensively. We're building the software with LLMs, and it's not going so well. Hope this doesn't go public, but it's not going so well. Everybody else thinks it's going amazingly well, and I can see the wall coming. Because what people don't understand is, and I say that about the people in my company who are very, very smart. I've got lots of people with 15, 20 years experience don't really see this coming, is that when you get LLMs to build software in just any old way without any discipline, the technical debt exponentially increases to the point where the software will collapse in on itself. Just in the same way, all of this money that's going into Anthropic and OpenAI we all know it's unsustainable. Anybody who's read Ed Zitron, that there is no backup plan here. Now, when Facebook raised all their money, they had some kind of a plan, and Facebook went to hell. There was a brief period of time when social media where it did democratize, and I would still argue it's had democratized in very small ways. But yeah, obviously, like now that the evil overlords are in charge of everything, then it's all gone. Yeah, that dream has completely died. But I remember Twitter for like 2 or 3 years at the beginning was absolutely democratizing my life. At least I could speak to heroes of mine, and they would tweet me back, and I could actually get their opinions very quickly. So, but yeah, back to the AI thing. I hope and I pray that we will have. I'm not religious. That we will have an almighty collapse. I think it's all going to collapse in on itself. The bubble is going to burst. And the biggest destructive force I've seen in the software industry is venture capital funding. if we had no venture capital funding and every company had to build its own revenue streams, we would have a very, very different landscape. And obviously it's because social media is free, so you've got to fund it somehow, etc., etc. So I hope that we have this massive AI crash, the bubble bursts, and VCs then, we might have a window where VCs are very wary about the fact that they've just lost $1 trillion and they're not going to get that back. And maybe that might cause them to be a bit more cautious, and that might lead to the rise of independent, like family-run businesses that make their own software, and it could rebalance the scales. Just wondering what your thoughts are. It's all very speculative, of course.
Thank you, John, for those thoughts. There's a lot there. And you're obviously much more of an expert on some of these issues than I am, so I can't really speak to them. But, what you're describing is related to the fact that some of the model capabilities have advanced a lot, but sometimes people call them jagged, meaning that they can't do many things while they do some things. And it's actually uncertain which ones they do, which ones they can't do. That's why they're not actually really saving labor, and sometimes leading to high quality, sometimes leading to low quality. I think that's one of the major challenges for turning AI into high productivity and also slowing its spread within the business community. That being said, I think that jaggedness is not a barrier to more and more automation, because sometimes companies are willing to sacrifice quality for cost saving. And I wouldn't be as sanguine as you about a big collapse, because right now our macroeconomy depends so much on AI investments that if that happened, that would be a big shock to employment, to consumption. And the last thing we need right now is a recession that would shake people's confidence and trust in democratic institutions even more. So all the more reason for why we really need a more proactive approach about how we can make this AI technology, which I have argued and believed for a long time is extremely promising, really deliver that promise. And I am afraid, like you are, perhaps not as much as you, but I'm afraid just like you are, that that promise is being squandered.
Thank you so much. So we have a bunch of questions. I'm just going to get all the 3 questions in at the same time, and then we will see whether there are overlaps and how, Daron, you would like to address them. So David, we're going from economist to economist. This is my lucky day.
Thanks very much for doing this conversation. I'm a retired economist. I'm old and out of the way now.
Very nice meeting you.
Good to meet you. I want to think about kind of the scope of how we think about liberalism. I think over the past 20 or 30 years, as illiberal ideas and movements have arisen, we've also seen a retreat more and more into nationalism and that sort of thing. But if you look at, and that's kind of in the context of globalization and that kind of stuff. But I think if you look broadly at like the past 25 or 30 years, and I'm thinking kind of in terms of Branko Milanovich's elephant chart, which has been criticized as not being entirely correct, but it's a good general idea. If you look at the rise of incomes in China and East Asia, if anything, the past 25 years has been a golden age in terms of human prosperity. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the globalization ideas were sold as something that could be addressed in the West by transfers from those who were benefiting to those who were obviously going to be affected negatively. And that just didn't happen. My economist joke slogan for that is counter Hicks was not a fix. And I wonder how we should think about liberalism in that context. Do we want the scope of who we're thinking about as humans who we want to be flourishing as broadening over time? I think it has historically. I don't think John Stuart Mill was necessarily thinking about Victorian working class folks in his ideas about flourishing as strongly as we might. Yeah. So I wonder if we can also break out of the nationalism framework and thinking about the kinds of ideas that you're advocating and trying to flesh out.
Thank you, David. And this is so the expansion of liberalism, which you do, Daron, touch upon in the book quite a bit. So we will get to that. Sabine, and then I'm going to do Virgil and Rich in the second round. So let's just do Sabine, you next, and we will combine the questions.
Hi, Daron. You're often labeled as a pessimist, but I think it's much more subtle than that. I wondered if you could speak in more detail about AI and jobs and what it would take for AI to enable jobs. And given the current conversation that we're having, I was wondering if you could speak maybe a bit to I haven't read your book either, but David Otter talks about the expanding middle class jobs. I don't know if this is related to that. Also, given the abundance conversation, there's a lot of hope that AI will increase state capacity and institutional capacity. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit of that. Is that hopeful? Is that something we could look forward to? Or do you think that's a bit like laptops in schools where it seems hopeful now, but in 15 years it might be a disaster?
Beautiful. So we have expansion of liberalism, middle class jobs, and state capacity. A lot of expansions.
Okay. So there's a lot to cover there. So I agree with you, David. Inclusion, what I call inclusion in the book, is something that was a dilemma of liberalism because they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't care about it, the sort of leading liberal thinkers. And it's a challenge that, liberalism as an establishment had to grapple with. A difficult one. But I also take a stand against the very strong universalist ideas of current liberal thinkers. Because given what I said earlier, that we have to form compromises and form broad coalitions, they can only stand on shared common values. And liberalism, at least as I define it, has a lot of community action, civic action, redistribution, sacrifices that you make for other people in your community, in your society. None of that is possible if you do not identify with people who you share the society with. And that's where I think universalism of the most extreme form runs into a problem. You actually destroy the basis of that shared moral understanding. And when people within, say, the United States feel themselves much closer to people at the other end of the world than their neighbors, that I think is not going to work. So that's why we do need, of course, global institutions, because we have so many global challenges. But you need to form those global institutions from the nation up in the same way that you need to form the national institutions from the local community up.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, David. In terms of your second question, Sabine, yes, I think greater state capacity is very important. I actually am doing some research on that. I think there are a lot of possibilities in using AI for that. That's increasing human agency while at the same time leveraging state capacity. But there's a huge dark side of that state capacity. Centralizing AI models can, of course, become a tool for surveillance, repression, imposing uniform thoughts, killing dissent. You can see a little bit of that in China, or some would say more than a little bit of it, but I think that's still the tip of the iceberg. And there's a corporate version of it, because the fact that corporations centralize information doesn't mean we are immune to that. So I think there are a lot of challenges there that we have to grapple with. In terms of using AI to create more jobs, David and I have worked on that together. He is slightly more optimistic than I am, but we have written some of those papers together. I don't think on its current path, AI will do anything like expand middle-class jobs, But I argue in the book and in some of my other writings, some of it together with David, that it has that potential. And we have to approach AI more like a tool that increases the contribution of workers and expertise of workers, enables them to be more innovative and do new things, rather than just automate work for that to be achieved.
Thank you so much. Virgil?
Hello, Professor. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. Your book, How Nations Fail, was very influential to me. And I actually used to work in your building, so
Oh, thank you.
I want to thank you so much for doing this public interaction here. Okay, so when you cited the competitors to liberal democracy, you mentioned Trump, Reform, and Orban. Politely, the intellectuals I talk to, they don't mention those guys. They talk like Singapore, they talk Hong Kong, they talk Shanghai, they talk Dubai. They say those are the real competitors to liberal democracy. None of this populist stuff. And I mean, I don't know. I guess I want like they say, that's yeah. I mean, those are the realistic thing. I mean, they say if we were to replace, San Francisco or New York with something, it'd be something like that, rather than one of these other things that you mentioned. I just kind of wanted sort of like your reply to that. Because I mean that seems to be. I mean, I guess there's like the dumb authoritarianism. Sure. I mean, you see on the news every day. The smart authoritarians are actually the ones that actually like. I was like, oh wow, I can't actually trivially beat you. So okay.
It's always very interesting, right? When counterculture becomes right wing. We've seen this a couple of times in history, like Weimar Germany, Rozek's Czechoslovakia, where the liberal parents fail in their duty, and the young people, the pop culture becomes right wing. It always becomes very, very interesting. But yeah, and I'm coming to you, Rich, in a moment, but it's just so interesting to me. I feel like the thing we are not saying is basically whether liberalism or the liberal tradition is giving us an immune system, right? Like China didn't have the liberal tradition to save them from immediate centralization when technology happened, but do we have that in kind of the Louis Hartz way? Rich, we will combine yours with Virgil, so I hope it's super different and you're giving us some fun dialectic here.
Is it okay for me to jump in?
Please do, yes, please.
Yeah. So in the context of democratic backsliding, and I deeply appreciate your book, which I was able to read this summer on why nations fail. The challenge that I see is really how do you operationalize the lessons or insights that you have in that book in the context of democratic backsliding? And in particular, are there 2 or 3 lessons from your Why Nations Fail research and your current book that you would offer to public administrators to operationalize those lessons in support of the values of liberalism and advancing the public good and addressing democratic backsliding?
Mm-hmm. So I think those are excellent questions. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Virgil. In terms of your question, Rich, and I know we are now at the end, so I'll try to be brief. Indeed, those are really challenging things to do at a time when trust in institutions is so low. But I give examples like the Irish Assembly on abortion and U.S. state referendums on gay marriage, that despite low trust in institutions and divisive topics, we're able to bring people around and change people's minds. So I think we're not completely hopeless, but it's a difficult task, 100%. I agree with that. Virgil, that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right that another alternative is Singapore or China. And there are many ways in which China and Singapore are doing better than the US in terms of building infrastructure and even on AI. I think there are 2 issues there, however. One is that I think the Chinese model is very difficult to replicate when you don't have the same degree of state capacity and sort of meritocratic selection into that state capacity. So most societies are not going to be able to do that. Even if you could do that, there are two problems with it. One is individual freedom, which I think a lot of people value and cherish. But second, and that's why there's a long chapter devoted to why liberalism, I argue that ultimately models like the Chinese ones will not have the same ability to generate collective knowledge, because that really requires individual and collective experimentation and that information to disseminate, and freedom and the right relation between individual behavior and community are essential for that, and authoritarian models are not going to achieve that. China has been brilliant in many things, but at many critical points, it also benefited from lots of information that was generated in the rest of the world. And a world of authoritarian governments, I think, would be very different. But this was a very, very interesting, very fruitful discussion. Thank you so much for putting this together, Anna.
Thank you so much, Daron. And I mean, one way in which China and America are dealing with the same stuff, despite their very, very different systems, is that they both have fertility crisis, right? It's a different way of, according to your new paper as well, it's a different way of having less workers in the future. It's not just because of automation that this might happen. It's also that there might just be fewer people around in many, many countries that are advanced. Thank you so much, Daron, for joining us and for your
Thank you, everybody.
book and debut, and everybody for being here and listening and sharing your own thoughts. We will continue the discussion on our Discord. I know everybody has so much more to say. Daron, congratulations, and thank you for writing this book and for your work on helping us not just save democracy, but even just figuring out what it is so we can all participate better.
Participation is key. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.